Well, she has allies. There's again Team Camilla. One thing people don't realize is the fact that this is all the whole royal setup basically is competition among the various royal houses. And when you think about it, it's all about money because they're trying to get the dollars for
The papers were already on the table when the room went silent. King Charles had just been shown the legal finding that could strip Camilla's family of the home they believed was secure. No announcement had prepared them for it. No warning had softened it. According to the account behind this story, the king's legal advisors had traced the property arrangement back to an old agreement and found a provision that could change everything. Camilla's relatives had entered the dispute, expecting questions, perhaps negotiations, perhaps another private discussion about the future of the residence. Instead, the documents sitting in front of them reportedly raised a far more dangerous question. Had they ever possessed the legal right to remain there on the terms they believed were guaranteed? And that is where the story turns cold. Hi viewers, if you believe a family should not be able to lose its home because someone finally decided to read an old agreement differently, would you stand with them by leaving a comment right now? Just answer yes or no. Then like this video and subscribe. Because if powerful people can change the rules around a family's home without ordinary people questioning it, silence only makes that easier. The reported dispute was no longer about whether Camilla's relatives felt at home there.
for their various causes and philanthropies. So Charles does not want to be upstaged. He hated being upstaged by Diana, and he doesn't want to even be upstaged by his son, William. So there is that kind of competition. So in Team Camilla, her friends were floating in the press.
Feelings were suddenly irrelevant. Years of familiarity could not answer the question the lawyers had placed before the king. What mattered was the document, the wording inside it, and the rights that wording actually created. Charles reportedly studied the material, while his advisors explained the consequences. The atmosphere surrounding the decision became tense, because every possible response carried a cost. If he ignored the lawyers, he risked allowing an arrangement that the legal review had questioned. If he followed their recommendation, the consequences would land directly on Camilla's family. That was the trap. For years, the residence had reportedly represented stability. It was not simply four walls and a roof. It had become part of the family's expectations. Its continued occupation had created a sense that the future had already been decided. Then, one legal review threatened to tear that certainty apart. The most important detail was allegedly hidden in an old agreement. Not a new document created during the dispute, not a sudden order written after tensions began. Something much older. That detail matters because it raises a question that hangs over the entire story. If the clause had been sitting there for years, why had nobody acted on it before? Was it overlooked? Was it misunderstood? Had later arrangements quietly been built around an assumption that the original paperwork never actually supported? Or had everyone simply become so comfortable with the arrangement that nobody imagined anyone would ever challenge it? Those questions reportedly became impossible to avoid once the lawyers began comparing the old agreement with the more recent arrangements surrounding the property. And according to the premise of this account, that comparison produced the discovery that shocked the family most. The legal problem was not necessarily that Camilla's relatives had suddenly done something wrong. It was that the foundation beneath their entire expectation may have been weaker than they had ever been told. That distinction changes the emotional weight of what happened. A family can fight to protect something it believes belongs to it. But discovering that the law may never have recognized that belief in the first place is a different kind of blow. It does not simply threaten the future, it forces people to question the past. Every conversation about the property can suddenly look different. Every assurance can be reconsidered. Every assumption that seemed harmless can begin to look like a promise that was never backed by the authority to make it. The silence around the room would have carried its own meaning. Nobody needed to raise a voice when a single sentence in an old agreement could outweigh years of family expectations. That is what made the discovery so dangerous. It did not arrive as an accusation shouted across a room. It arrived as legal language, dry and precise, with consequences that could reach far beyond the people sitting there. And once Charles had been shown the alleged weakness in the arrangement, turning away from it would no longer be simple. The king would have to decide whether loyalty to an established family understanding mattered more than the legal structure governing the property. And somewhere inside that realization was the reason Charles reportedly decided that the old arrangement could no longer continue as before. Camilla was now caught in the middle. On one side stood her family.
Clarence House is just around the corner from Buckingham Palace. It's just off the Mall, and even though it's a palace, perhaps it's more homely than Buckingham Palace. It's 200 years old. It's full of items which have been collected by the royal family over the centuries.
Facing the possibility of losing the home and challenging the interpretation that had suddenly placed their position in doubt. On the other stood the king and his legal advisors, armed with paperwork that allegedly gave them grounds to act. But there was still one thing nobody had fully answered. Why had this provision remained buried for so long? That question was about to become more important than the house itself. Because the deeper the lawyers reportedly went into the history of the agreement, the clearer it became that the property dispute might be only the visible part of a much older problem. And if that was true, then Charles had not simply been handed a reason to remove Camilla's family. He had been handed a reason to reconsider whether the arrangement should ever have existed in the form everyone had come to accept. That is why the next document mattered, because it could show whether this was merely an unfortunate legal oversight, or whether the people surrounding the property had been relying for years on an assumption that the original agreement had already ruled out. And once that answer emerged, the question would no longer be whether Camilla's family could keep the home. It would be who had ever had the right to promise it to them in the first place. The house had not changed overnight. The belief surrounding it had. For years, Camilla's relatives had reportedly treated the residence as a settled part of their future. Doors opened for them. Family conversations included the property as though continued occupancy were already understood. There was no obvious deadline hanging over the arrangement, no public warning that one day the king's lawyers might question its foundations.
Kind of accusations that Kate wasn't working hard enough, that Kate was sitting at home, and here's that Princess Anne doing 400 engagements a year, Charles doing 500 engagements a year, and Kate's only doing, 40.
That quiet continuity was precisely what made the latest review so unsettling. Nothing about the property had suddenly become different. The paperwork had, and once lawyers began placing the old agreement beside the later arrangements, the difference between what the family believed and what the documents appeared to permit became impossible to ignore. The relatives were not necessarily acting as though they had taken something that belonged to them. From their perspective, the arrangement had endured for years. That kind of stability creates its own authority. When people see the same doors, the same rooms, and the same family names attached to a residence year after year, permanence begins to feel like a fact. But legal rights do not always grow simply because an arrangement lasts. That was the uncomfortable principle now sitting beneath the dispute. The reported review focused on several connected questions. Who had the legal right to occupy the residence? What obligations came with that occupation? Had those obligations been properly observed? And most importantly, did the original agreement actually provide the level of security that Camilla's relatives believed it provided? The answers were not arriving in the form of dramatic accusations. They were emerging from old language, financial records, and provisions that had apparently received little attention for years. That made the situation more dangerous. A family argument can be settled with a conversation. A legal inconsistency is different. Once lawyers identify a provision that could affect property rights.
But, if she has any serious character flaws, I cannot find them. I felt the same way about JFK Jr. I thought that he was really just in the end, a great guy, and I feel the same way about her. a super human being.
Ignoring it becomes much harder, and Charles was reportedly being forced to confront something he may not have expected when the review began. The arrangement had acquired a life of its own. People had planned around it. Expectations had formed around it. Financial decisions had reportedly been made with the understanding that the residents would remain available. The longer that continued, the harder it became to separate the legal arrangement from the emotional belief surrounding it. That is where Camilla's position became especially difficult. Her family could look at years of continuity and reasonably ask why everything should suddenly be questioned. If the arrangement had been tolerated for so long, why should one review overturn it now? Why should an old provision suddenly carry more weight than the understanding that had developed over years? Those questions reportedly mattered to Camilla, but they did not answer the lawyers' central concern. The lawyers were not being asked whether the arrangement felt fair. They were being asked whether it was legally defensible. That distinction became the fault line. If the agreement clearly supported the family's continued position, then the review could end with reassurance. The old paperwork would simply confirm what everyone already believed. But if the paperwork said something different, years of assumption could not rewrite it. And that possibility was beginning to frighten the people closest to the residents. There was another complication. The dispute was not merely about occupancy. It reportedly involved financial obligations connected to the property. That meant the legal team was not looking at one isolated sentence. They were examining the entire structure surrounding the residence, including who was responsible for what and whether those responsibilities matched the way the property had actually been managed. Every answer produced another question. Had expenses been handled under the correct arrangement? Had later understandings been formally documented? Had anyone assumed that Charles possessed powers that belonged elsewhere? And had the family been relying on verbal assurances that were never converted into enforceable rights? Those questions made the atmosphere increasingly tense. Because if the final answer was that the family had misunderstood the legal foundation of its position, then the king would face a decision that could not be hidden behind family courtesy. He would have to choose between preserving an established expectation and acting on what his advisors believed the documents required. That is why the old agreement became the center of everything. It was no longer a dusty piece of paperwork sitting somewhere in an archive. It had become the one object capable of deciding whether years of certainty were real. If you think Camilla's family deserves a hearing, leave a comment, like this video, and subscribe, because staying silent could let powerful people decide everything without challenge. It was that possibility that made the next stage of the review so important. It was that nobody could confidently prove that the promise they had relied upon had ever carried the legal force they assumed. That difference is enormous. A promise can create loyalty. It can create gratitude. It can create a sense of belonging. But a promise cannot automatically create ownership. The lawyers were reportedly drawing a line between those two worlds, and Camilla's family was standing on the wrong side of it. If that line held, the residence could no longer be treated as a permanent family guarantee. It would have to be treated according to the original legal framework. That prospect explains why the dispute reportedly became so personal. For Camilla, this was not an abstract question about clauses and obligations. Her relatives were facing the loss of a place they had come to regard as secure. For Charles, the issue carried a different burden. His decision could still be interpreted as a personal choice involving his wife's family, even if the legal advisors were the ones pressing the issue. And for the lawyers, the calculation was simpler. The documents had to mean what they said. That is the moment viewers need to stop seeing this as a simple royal family feud. Because the real conflict was forming between two kinds of power. There was the power of years of family expectation, and there was the power of a written agreement that could survive every change in the people who relied upon it. If the agreement had truly been clear, then why had the family's understanding developed in another direction? That question was still unanswered. And somewhere inside the old paperwork was reportedly the provision that could explain it. The provision had not appeared because Charles suddenly wanted Camilla's family out. It had existed before the current dispute, before the latest review, before the arguments, before anyone realized how important it might become. The longer the lawyers examined it, the more difficult it became to dismiss as harmless legal language. Then came the discovery that changed the direction of the review. The old agreement did not simply describe the property. It contained a condition concerning the future of the arrangement. And that condition was precisely where the family's confidence began to collapse. The room no longer needed speculation about what Charles wanted. The document was beginning to answer a much more damaging question. What had Charles actually been allowed to promise? And if the answer was less than everyone believed, then the king's decision to strip Camilla's family of their home was no longer simply a personal royal choice. It was the consequence of something that had been written down long before anyone expected the argument to happen. The next page would show just how serious that consequence could become. Once that provision was read closely, the family would discover why lawyers believed the arrangement could not continue, because everyone had accepted it. The next page was where the argument stopped being about what the family believed and became a question of what the law actually allowed. The lawyers reportedly went back to the original agreement and examined the language surrounding the residence with a different purpose. They were no longer looking for evidence that the arrangement had existed. Everyone already knew that. They were looking for the legal mechanism that determined how long it could exist, who could benefit from it, and whether later understandings could override the original terms. What they reportedly found was the part that had been hiding in plain sight. The old agreement appeared to contain a condition governing the continuation of the family's rights to the property. It was not written in the language of a modern family promise. It belonged to an older legal framework, where words such as occupancy, interest, obligation, and succession could carry consequences far beyond what an ordinary reader might expect. And that distinction was about to become devastating. The family had looked at years of uninterrupted occupancy and seen security. The lawyers looked at the agreement and saw a limit. Those two interpretations could exist peacefully only as long as nobody challenged the arrangement. Now somebody had. The legal team reportedly began comparing the original agreement against subsequent paperwork connected to the residence. The purpose was simple. If later documents had formally changed the original arrangement, then the family might still have a strong position. But if later documents merely reflected an informal understanding, the older agreement could remain controlling. That was the problem. The passage that mattered did not need to say the family had done anything wrong. It only needed to establish that continued occupation depended on conditions that had never been satisfied in the way everyone assumed. And once that possibility emerged, years of certainty began to look very different. A relative could remember being told the home would remain available. Another could point to years of financial arrangements. Someone else could point to conversations within the family. But none of those things could automatically erase an older legal condition. The lawyers reportedly explained the distinction carefully. An assurance is not necessarily a transfer. An expectation is not necessarily an entitlement, and continued use is not necessarily ownership. Those three ideas became the invisible walls closing around the family. The first wall was the original agreement. The second was the absence of a clearly documented change to that agreement. The third was the question of whether Charles had possessed the authority to make a permanent promise concerning a property governed by someone else's legal structure. That last question was the most uncomfortable, because it meant the king could have acted in good faith and still made a promise that the law could not fully support. That possibility changed the emotional meaning of the dispute. If Charles had simply decided one morning that Camilla's relatives should leave, the story would be easy to understand. It would be a family decision. But if the lawyers were correct, Charles was not necessarily creating the problem. He was uncovering it. And that is where the title of this story becomes far more complicated than it first appears. The claim that Charles stripped Camilla's family of their home suggests an act of power. The documents suggested something more complicated. They suggested a legal boundary, a boundary that had apparently been ignored because nobody expected it to matter. The family reportedly pushed back. Their argument was understandable. If the arrangement had been accepted for years, why should the meaning suddenly change? If people had relied upon it, made plans around it, and treated the residents as part of their future, why should an old clause now erase all of that? Those questions carried emotional force. But legal documents do not measure emotional force. They measure rights, obligations, permissions, restrictions, and the authority behind them. That was why the lawyers reportedly kept returning to the same point. What exactly had been granted? What exactly had been promised? And what exactly could be enforced? The answers were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The arrangement appeared to give the family a level of security in practice that was not necessarily equivalent to permanent legal ownership. That difference had been almost invisible while everyone cooperated. It became enormous the moment the king's advisors began questioning it. Then another issue surfaced. The financial side of the arrangement reportedly raised additional questions about responsibility for the residents. Who was paying for what? Which expenses belonged to the occupants? Which expenses belonged to the property itself? And had money been spent in a way that assumed a future the legal documents did not guarantee? These questions mattered because money leaves evidence. Family conversations can disappear. Private assurances can be remembered differently by different people. But invoices, agreements, payments, and formal records create a trail. The lawyers were reportedly following that trail, and the deeper they went, the less the dispute looked like a sudden disagreement between Charles and Camilla's family. It began to look like the inevitable collision between an informal understanding and an older legal structure. That was when the possibility of a major decision became unavoidable. If the original agreement still governed the residents, then continuing the family's arrangement could potentially create a larger legal problem. Charles would not simply be allowing his wife's relatives to remain. He could be allowing an arrangement that his own advisors had warned him was inconsistent with the governing documents. For a king, that creates an extraordinary dilemma. Personal loyalty points one way, legal responsibility points another, and Camilla was standing directly between them. The pressure reportedly increased as her relatives questioned why the review had become so serious. The answer was buried in the paperwork. The lawyers were not discovering a new disagreement. They were discovering that the old agreement had never stopped mattering. That was the first major reversal. The family had believed the passage of time had strengthened their position. The lawyers believed the passage of time had merely allowed the misunderstanding to continue. And those are completely different interpretations of history. One says 15 years of stability proves that the arrangement was accepted. The other says 15 years of stability can conceal a legal mistake. The question now became whether Charles would choose to preserve the mistake because it had become comfortable, or correct it because the documents demanded it. That decision reportedly came after the legal team completed its review. And according to the story behind this dispute, the conclusion was not what Camilla's family expected. The recommendation was that the existing arrangement could not simply continue on the same basis. The king was being told that if he wanted to protect the integrity of the property arrangement, something had to change. Not eventually, not when convenient, now. That was the moment the family's position became genuinely vulnerable. Because until then, they could still believe the lawyers were simply raising questions. Now the lawyers had reached a conclusion, and Charles had to respond. The residence that had seemed secure was suddenly facing a different future. Camilla reportedly understood the personal consequences immediately. Her relatives were no longer waiting for clarification about a technical clause. They were facing the possibility that the arrangement they had relied upon for years could be terminated. And yet even then, one question remained unanswered. Why had the clause been overlooked for so long? That question refused to disappear. If it had been there from the beginning, someone had either failed to notice its significance, misunderstood its effect, or assumed it would never be challenged. But there was another possibility. Perhaps the arrangement had always depended on an interpretation that was never as solid as everyone believed. That possibility would explain why the lawyers were suddenly taking such a hard position. It would also explain why Charles had been placed in such an uncomfortable position. He could not simply point at the family and say they had taken something. The more accurate conclusion was far more unsettling. They may have built a future around something that the legal documents never promised. And once that became clear, the king had only two choices. He could preserve the family's expectation, or he could follow the paperwork. The next move would determine whether the dispute remained a private disagreement or became an irreversible royal decision. Because Charles was about to make the choice that would finally turn a legal review into action. The decision was no longer theoretical. Charles had the legal advice in front of him, and according to the account behind this story, the recommendation was clear enough to force a choice. The arrangement surrounding the residence could not simply continue because everyone had grown accustomed to it. If the old agreement remained legally controlling, then the expectations built around the property had to be reconsidered. That was the moment the dispute reportedly changed character. Until then, Camilla's family could still hope that the review would end with a compromise. But Charles was no longer being asked to decide what felt fair. He was being asked to decide what should happen after his lawyers had identified a problem in the legal foundation of the arrangement. And the king reportedly chose the harder path. He accepted the recommendation that the existing arrangement should be brought to an end or fundamentally changed. Impact was immediate. Camilla's relatives were suddenly facing the possibility of leaving a residence they had regarded as secure. The home had not been taken away because someone had walked in and declared a personal grudge. The reported reasoning was much colder. The legal review had allegedly concluded that the family's continued position could not be treated as permanent simply because it had lasted for years. That distinction would become the heart of the confrontation. Camilla's side reportedly challenged the interpretation. If the arrangement had been accepted for so long, why should an old clause suddenly outweigh everything that had happened since? Why had nobody warned the family earlier? Why had later understandings been allowed to develop if they were supposedly incompatible with the original agreement? Those were powerful questions. But the lawyers had another question. Where was the formal document that actually changed the original terms? That question reportedly left the room with nowhere comfortable to go. A verbal understanding could explain why the family felt secure. A history of uninterrupted occupation could explain why nobody expected a dispute, but neither automatically proved that the underlying legal rights had changed. And that was the point the lawyers kept returning to. The residence was not governed by emotion. It was governed by the agreement. The more the family challenged the decision, the more the argument reportedly moved away from Charles personally and back toward the wording of the documents. That was important because it weakened the simplest version of the story. If Charles was simply trying to punish Camilla's family, then the obvious motive would be personal. But if the lawyers had genuinely identified a legal restriction, Charles could argue that he was not creating a new rule. He was enforcing an old one. That distinction would not make the decision painless. Camilla was still watching her family face the loss of a home, and the emotional consequences reportedly became harder to separate from the legal ones. Then a lawyer reads one provision differently, and suddenly the future becomes uncertain. That was the pressure surrounding Camilla. Her family had reportedly believed the arrangement was settled. Charles was now being told that settlement was not what the documents actually guaranteed. And then came the discovery that made the situation even more uncomfortable. The legal team reportedly found inconsistencies between the original agreement and the later paperwork connected to the residence. That meant the problem was not simply that someone had forgotten one sentence. The problem may have been that later decisions had been made on a foundation that was never properly secured. This was the point where the dispute began to look less like a sudden royal punishment and more like the correction of a long-running legal misunderstanding. But that interpretation created its own problem. If Charles had been making assurances over the years, did he know those assurances might not be enforceable? The story does not establish what was inside Charles's mind when those expectations were formed. What matters to the story is that the lawyer's review reportedly forced those assumptions into the open. And once they were exposed, the king could no longer pretend the question did not exist. That was why the decision carried such emotional weight. Charles was not merely deciding what happened to a residence. He was deciding whether a family understanding could survive contact with the legal documents that governed it. The answer, according to the account, was no. The arrangement would have to change. Camilla's relatives reportedly wanted the matter reconsidered, but the legal advisors had already drawn their line. If the original agreement remained valid, then later expectations could not simply replace it, and that left Charles with an uncomfortable position. He had to enforce a conclusion that would directly affect his wife's family. The decision, therefore, carried a personal cost, even if the legal reasoning was sound. Camilla was not simply watching lawyers debate a document. She was watching a promise associated with her family's future become uncertain, and that is where the story takes its most important turn. Because the lawyers had not finished examining the documents, there was reportedly another provision, one that could answer the question nobody had yet asked loudly enough. If Camilla's family could not retain the home under the arrangement they believed they had, then who was supposed to benefit from the property instead? That question changed the stakes completely. Until this point, everyone had been focused on who might lose. Now the attention shifted toward who might gain. The answer was not immediately obvious. The legal structure reportedly contained rules concerning what happened when the existing arrangement ended. Those rules mattered because they could determine where the property ultimately went without Charles having to make a personal choice. That possibility would be devastating for anyone who believed the king could simply redirect the residence toward Camilla's family. If the agreement already contained a succession mechanism, then Charles's personal preference might have far less power than anyone assumed. And this was where the deeper meaning of the lawyer's discovery began to emerge. The real question was never simply whether Charles wanted Camilla's relatives to stay. The real question was whether he had the legal authority to guarantee that they could stay. Those are not the same thing. A king can influence many things, but influence is not identical to ownership. Authority is not identical to entitlement, and a private promise is not identical to a legally enforceable transfer. That distinction reportedly left Camilla's family facing a reality they had not expected. It could have been discussed within the family for years, and yet the law could still say that the future belonged somewhere else. The room had begun with a dispute over an old agreement. It was now becoming a dispute over the limits of royal power itself. And there was another detail that made the timing even more significant. The lawyers were reportedly not merely advising Charles to end the arrangement, they were examining what would happen after it ended. That meant the next document could reveal the property's intended destination. It could show whether the residence would remain within the wider family structure, pass to another beneficiary, or become subject to a different arrangement entirely. For Camilla's relatives, that was the moment the fear became real. Losing the home was one thing. Discovering that the home had never been theirs to inherit was something much harder to accept. And Charles now had to confront the same truth from the other side. If he had promised something that the documents did not permit him to deliver, then the most painful part of this dispute was not that the lawyers had taken something from Camilla's family. It was that they had exposed the limits of what he could give. The king could not simply rewrite the past because the family had built expectations around it. He could not make an old legal provision disappear because changing course would hurt people close to him. And he could not turn an informal understanding into permanent ownership by royal preference alone. The documents had created the boundary. Now Charles had to live with it. But before the meeting could end, the lawyers reportedly turned to the provision governing the property after the existing arrangement expired. And when that section was examined, the entire dispute was about to be turned upside down. Because the person who ultimately stood to benefit was not who Camilla's family had expected, and it was not necessarily who Charles would have chosen. The next revelation would show that the home had been tied to a larger succession structure all along. That meant the decision to remove Camilla's family was only the first half of the story. The second half was about to reveal who had been waiting in the legal line behind them. The final document reportedly answered the question that had been hanging over the entire dispute, and its answer changed the meaning of everything that had happened before. Camilla's family had been focused on one question: how could they keep the home? The lawyers were looking at a different question: what was supposed to happen to the property when the existing arrangement ended? According to the story behind this dispute, the answer was already contained in the legal structure surrounding the residence. The property was not simply waiting for Charles to decide which relative should receive it. Its future was governed by terms that had been established before the latest disagreement ever existed. He was not necessarily choosing to take a home away from Camilla's family because of a personal conflict. He was reportedly accepting the conclusion that the old arrangement could no longer be treated as permanent, and that is the detail that makes the entire story so much more uncomfortable. If the legal framework had been followed from the beginning, then the family's expectation may never have been as secure as it appeared. Once Charles accepted that distinction, the dispute moved toward its final consequence. The family would have to give up the arrangement surrounding the residence. There would be no dramatic royal announcement. No public spectacle was necessary. The power of the decision came from its quietness. A legal conclusion had been reached, and the family now had to deal with what it meant in practical terms. Rooms that had felt permanent suddenly had to be reconsidered. Plans that had been built around continued occupancy could no longer be treated as certain, and the people who had believed the residence was part of their future were forced to confront the possibility that they had mistaken familiarity for ownership. That is where the emotional heart of this story sits, and the lawyer's discovery reportedly threatened that sense of permanence. But the most revealing part was what it said about Charles himself. For years, the king could have believed that maintaining the arrangement was simply an act of family loyalty. The reported story does not establish what he privately believed when those expectations were formed. It does, however, present a striking possibility. Charles may have been treating a personal assurance as though it could accomplish something the underlying agreement did not allow. If that was what happened, then the lawyers did not merely take a home from Camilla's family. They exposed the limit of the king's power to give it to them, and it explains why the legal review mattered so much. A royal family can negotiate feelings, it can repair relationships, it can offer private assurances, but when property rights depend upon formal documents, those documents eventually have the final word. That is precisely why the old clause became so important. It survived changing relationships, it survived changing expectations, and according to the account, it survived years of people behaving as though the property's future had already been decided. Then the document was finally taken seriously. The consequence was unavoidable. Camilla's relatives could challenge the interpretation, question the timing, and argue that the arrangement had been accepted for years. But unless they could establish that the original terms had been legally changed, the old provision remained the foundation of the dispute. And that left Charles with little room to preserve the arrangement simply because ending it would be painful. The irony is that the king may have been trapped by the very family understanding he had tried to protect. The more established the expectation became, the more painful the correction would be. But pain does not necessarily make the correction wrong. It simply makes it harder to accept. That is why this story should not be reduced to Charles versus Camilla. There is a more complicated conflict underneath it. It is the conflict between loyalty and law, between what people are told and what they can prove, between a promise made inside a family and a right created on paper. And once that distinction became visible, the residence itself almost became secondary. The real prize was certainty. Who had the authority to decide the future? Who had the legal right to remain? And who had been assuming an outcome that the documents never guaranteed? Those questions had finally been forced into the open. If this story makes you uncomfortable, because the same rules do not always appear to apply when powerful families are involved, then do not just watch and move on. Leave your view in the comments, share this story with someone who follows royal affairs, and subscribe. If ordinary people would be expected to respect a contract when their home is involved, then powerful people should face the same questions when their own arrangements are challenged. That is the larger issue hiding behind this royal property dispute. It is not simply whether Camilla's family lost a residence. It is whether years of assumption can ever become stronger than the document underneath them. And according to the account, the answer eventually became clear. The old agreement won. Charles had to act on the legal conclusion placed before him. Camilla's family had to confront a future they had not expected, and the residence was pulled back from the expectation that it would remain permanently connected to them. But there was one final detail that gave the entire episode its sharpest edge. The property had not suddenly become unavailable because someone in the family changed their mind. Its future had reportedly been governed by rules that were already there. The lawyers did not create those rules. They uncovered their relevance. That distinction matters because it removes some of the drama from the king personally and places it where the story says it belongs, inside the forgotten agreement. For Charles, that may have been the most difficult part. The decision could look from the outside like a king stripping his wife's family of a home. Inside, the legal logic of the dispute, however, it could be understood as a king discovering that his ability to make such a promise had been limited all along. For Camilla, the result would still be painful. Her relatives were losing something they had expected to keep. For the lawyers, the matter was more straightforward. They had found a provision that demanded attention. And for everyone watching from outside, the episode offered a lesson that reaches far beyond the royal family. A property can feel permanent without being permanently yours. A promise can feel binding without creating a legal right. And an arrangement can survive for years without surviving the document that originally created it. That is why the most shocking part of this story was never simply the decision to remove Camilla's family from the home. It was the reason behind it. The king reportedly acted because his legal advisors uncovered a problem that had been sitting quietly inside the property arrangement, waiting for someone to examine it closely. And once they did, 15 years of certainty reportedly began to unravel. The final image is therefore not Charles standing against Camilla's relatives. It is an old agreement finally being read for what it says. The home remains, the family expectations change, and the document outlasts them all. That is the part worth remembering. Because in royal disputes, people change, relationships change, titles change, and promises can be forgotten. Paper does not forget. And sometimes the most powerful person in the room is not the king, it is the clause nobody bothered to read.